I do not want to ease into this because the country is not easing into it. Politics in Britain has just done something it was not supposed to do. A machine that has run in roughly the same shape for more than 200 years is starting to shake itself apart. And most people still have not grasped what that means. I want to take you through one small election in a suburb of Manchester because sometimes the smallest events reveal the biggest structural change. And I want to use it to explain what is happening not just in Britain, but across the Western world. Then I want to bring it all the way back to the only question that matters. What do you do with this? How do you position yourself when the old political map is breaking and no one in the establishment seems capable of reading the new one? 6 months ago, I looked at the British betting markets the same way I look at any market. I asked a very simple question. What does the crowd believe? And where is the crowd probably wrong? At that point, the next general election was widely priced as a two-horse race. Reform was the clear favorite, Labour was the second horse. Everyone else was barely on the board. That made perfect sense inside the old British system because first past, the post is built to force politics into two channels. Britain likes to tell itself there are many parties, but the machinery has always tried to reduce those parties into a duel. America is much the same, different costumes, same architecture, so I started with the obvious premise. Living standards were still falling, inequality was still rising, the incumbent party was going to pay the price for that. In modern politics, if you are in power while people feel poorer, the public does not reward you for nuance, it punishes you for failure. That was my first bet. Labour's chances would fall. They did. Labour's implied chance of winning the next election fell sharply over the following months. That part was not hard to see. If the economy keeps hurting ordinary people, the party currently in office will bleed support. That has been one of the most dependable political trades in the developed world for years now. Then I made the second inference, and this is where the old system should have held. If one horse in a two-horse race weakens, the other horse should gain ground almost by default. If Labour becomes less likely to win, Reform should become more likely to win. That is what a stable two-party structure is supposed to do. It is the same logic that makes traditional election models work in the first place, and then something astonishing happened. Reform's probability of winning did not rise. It fell hard. So now you had the impossible situation in a political system designed to funnel power into two dominant parties. Both of the dominant parties were becoming less likely to win. The race was supposed to narrow. Instead, it started to shatter. I want you to slow down and really absorb that because this is the whole story. When both sides of a two-party system are simultaneously losing legitimacy, you are no longer looking at ordinary electoral volatility. You are looking at structural breakdown. Now, part of Reform's weakness is easy enough to explain. Donald Trump has spent the last several months reminding the world that right-wing insurgency does not automatically produce better living standards outside the United States. And increasingly inside it, people can see that a politician can be loud, disruptive, anti-establishment, and still preside over a reality in which ordinary people do not get richer. That realization matters because parties like Reform have benefited enormously from the public fantasy that simply smashing the old order will, by itself, improve material life. But the bigger reason Reform weakened was more mechanical than philosophical. They split. Rupert Lowe peeled away and started building Restore Britain. Under first past, the post, splitting a vote is like setting money on fire. The system punishes fragmentation savagely. So Reform damaged itself at exactly the moment it should have been inheriting Labour's collapse. That explains why Reform fell. It does not explain why Labour still failed to benefit. And that is where the story turns from interesting to historic. When I looked at the table again, the missing probability had not gone to the Conservatives in any meaningful way. It had not gone to the Liberal Democrats either. What happened instead was that new space opened up. Restore Britain appeared on the board. The Greens surged onto the board. Suddenly, Britain was no longer behaving like a two-horse system at all. It was acting like a broken field with 5 serious runners, perhaps more if you count the Nationalists properly. That has not happened in modern British democratic history. I do not mean it is unusual. I mean it is genuinely historic for generations. The Conservatives came first or second, Labour came first or second. The names of the major parties shifted over centuries, but the structure endured. The machine always compressed politics back into two dominant poles. And now in front of us that structure is fracturing. This is not just a British curiosity. Britain is late to it. Europe has been telling this story for years. In country after country, the two main centrist parties have bled support, lost seats, and watched their old monopoly on political legitimacy crack apart. Spain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, different institutions, different languages, same direction. The center decays, the vote splinters, and established parties go from governing by default to surviving by habit. The only reason America looks more stable is because its institutional barriers are even stronger. The rigidity is greater, not the health. If the walls were lower, you would likely see the same fragmentation there too, and the cause is not mysterious. When living standards stagnate or fall for long enough, voters do not merely become impatient. They stop believing in the architecture that delivered those outcomes. They stop trusting the parties that told them everything was basically fine. They stop believing in gradualism, managerialism, technical fixes, and all the polished centrist language that once sounded reassuring and now sounds evasive. That is what we are watching. Not just a polling wobble, not just a bad quarter for one prime minister. We are watching the exhaustion of a political settlement. Now let me bring you into the specific by-election, because this is where the abstract becomes almost comic in how revealing it is. Gorton and Denton is a suburb of Manchester, one seat. Not a government, not a revolution, just one parliamentary vacancy in a healthy system. A by-election like that is a manageable local contest. In a brittle system, it becomes a stress test. At this point, Labour was already deeply unpopular. Keir Starmer, by any conventional reading of British political sentiment, was in terrible shape. Reform was polling strongly nationally, but carrying all the liabilities I just described. The obvious Labour move, the almost embarrassingly obvious move, was to bring Andy Burnham into Parliament. Burnham was the mayor of Manchester. He was, and remains, one of the most personally popular Labour figures in the country. If your governing party is collapsing and your leader looks spent, the rational play is to elevate the strongest available replacement before the next general election. That is not factionalism. That is arithmetic. So when a seat in Manchester opened, the path was sitting there in plain view. Burnham could run, enter Parliament, and potentially become the credible route by which Labour avoided electoral disaster. Then Labour blocked him. I still find this extraordinary, because once you remove sentiment from it and just think as an investor, as a trader, as someone trying to maximize expected value, it makes almost no sense. Your best rescue option is visible. The data is screaming that your current course is bad, your current leader is deeply unpopular, your odds are weakening, and you block the one move that might materially improve your future position. That is not strategy, that is institutional self-harm. Now, once Burnham was blocked, the market understood immediately what that meant. The Greens became favorites for the by-election. Not because Britain had suddenly become a green country overnight, but because voters love by-elections as protest vehicles. Labour was already damaged, and Burnham had been the one figure who could have stabilized the contest. So from that point, the board was clear enough: Labour would probably lose. The only real question was to whom. And here is where the story becomes almost unbelievably stupid from Labour's side. Instead of accepting that they were probably going to lose one seat and preserving their strategic credibility for the much bigger general election, Labour decided to pretend that Gorton and Denton was a straight fight between themselves and Reform. They briefed that they had the data. They pushed the idea that this was a two-horse race. They wanted to invoke the old anti-far-right logic. Yes, you may dislike us, but surely you dislike them more. I understand why they wanted that frame. In the next general election, it may be the only decent card they have left. If they can persuade the public that the real choice is centrist incompetence or right-wing chaos, they may still survive. It has worked before in other countries. It worked for establishment forces in France against the far right. It worked for Joe Biden in the United States. It is not a beautiful strategy, but it can be an effective one. The madness is that they chose to burn that strategy in a by-election they were already likely to lose. Think about that. Your one plausible general election frame is that the country faces a binary choice between you and the far right. And then in a low-stakes local contest, you insist on that frame even though the betting market, the local mood, and the entire visible setup strongly suggest it is false. Then the election result lands and the Greens win. Labour does not even come second. The whole country watches your central claim get disproved in real time. You have just damaged the credibility of your most important future argument in exchange for absolutely nothing. If that were a corporate management team, I would call it reckless. If it were a capital allocation decision, I would call it indefensible. In politics, people will dress this kind of behavior up as messaging discipline or internal necessity. I call it what it is, an own goal. And the result mattered far beyond one seat because the betting markets moved on it. You could literally watch Labour's general election position weaken as this happened. That is, the market telling you the by-election was not interpreted as a local blip. It was interpreted as evidence that Labour's whole political story is weaker than previously thought. Now I want to talk about the Greens, because if you are going to understand the shape of the opportunity here, you have to understand why they became the beneficiary. The Greens had already been moving. Zach Polanski had been pushing a much more aggressive message around wealth taxes, inequality, and living standards. He had understood something that many legacy parties still seem too complacent to admit. Power is moving out of traditional media and into social media, and the public is far more open than the establishment thinks to a clear economic story that names inequality directly. This matters enormously because most political communication remains absurdly timid on the central economic reality of our time. People are getting poorer. Their children are likely to be poorer. And one of the most important reasons is the relentless concentration of wealth. That is not a fringe argument. It is not a slogan. It is the axis around which an immense amount of political frustration now turns, whether voters use that language or not. For years, my view has been very simple. If you can move public understanding toward that reality, if ordinary people begin to connect their declining living standards with rising inequality, then the parties will eventually be forced to respond. They will either adapt to that public understanding or they will decay. That was always the bet. And in Gorton and Denton, you could see part of that bet paying off. The Greens stepped into a space Labor had left wide open. They looked like a vehicle for a more serious economic anger. And voters moved. I will tell you honestly, I felt proud seeing that because it confirmed something larger than one campaign or one candidate. It confirmed that once the public is offered a frame that actually speaks to the pressure they feel in their lives, they move fast. That is the real lesson. Not that one smaller party had a nice week. Not that one by-election was dramatic. The lesson is that there is a giant political vacuum opening anywhere the center refuses to speak honestly about inequality, declining living standards, and the failure of the status quo. That vacuum will not stay empty. Somebody will fill it. Either the center changes or the insurgents inherit the field. And if the insurgents of the right inherit it, they will do what right-wing insurgents routinely do when they actually take power. They will cut taxes for the wealthy, protect capital, preserve inequality, and then disappoint the very voters who hope for relief. We are already seeing that pattern, which means those insurgent victories will not stabilize the system either. They will deepen the volatility. That is why I keep saying this is not just about who wins the next election. It is about the end of an old political era. Now, if you are sitting inside a traditional center, left party anywhere in the West, and you are still not understanding the magnitude of this, then I really do think you are living in a fantasy. If every comparable party around you has already weakened, fractured, or disappeared, and you are still defending the same economic orthodoxy that produced the collapse, then you are not being pragmatic. You are waiting to die politely. There is only one serious path back. Admit the status quo has failed. Admit that living standards have fallen. Admit that inequality is central to the story, and then move toward policies that show the public you actually intend to do something meaningful about it. Not a slogan, not a pamphlet, not an evasive sentence buried in a speech, a real offer. That is what politics has become. Make a credible offer or get replaced. And that brings me to what I think this means for the rest of us. You do not need to become hysterical. You do not need to think every election is the final battle of civilization. But you do need to understand that a massive period of political realignment is underway, and that passivity is a terrible response to it. If you care about wealth taxes, if you care about inequality, if you care about the economic future of your family, then voting cannot be treated like a hobby, and politics cannot be treated like football. You vote in every election. You vote in local elections. You vote in unglamorous elections. You do not wait for the dramatic moment and then complain that the options are bad. You use every point of pressure available to you, and you use it on the only basis that really matters. Which political force is making the best offer on inequality and the taxation of concentrated wealth? That is the standard, not charm, not tradition, not tribal loyalty offer. If a party wants your support, let it compete for it, let it show you what it will actually do, and if it offers you nothing, do not reward it out of habit. That is how leverage works. I would go further than that. If you care about changing the direction of politics, then education becomes part of the job. You talk to your family, you talk to your friends, you share the argument, you repeat it until it stops sounding exotic and starts sounding obvious. Why are living standards falling? Because inequality has grown and politics has failed to confront it. Why do your children risk being poorer than you? Because wealth has concentrated and the political class has protected that concentration instead of correcting it. If enough people understand those two sentences, politics changes. That is not romanticism. It is just how public opinion works. Once voters connect their personal pain to a structural cause, the parties are forced to reposition around that cause or lose ground to those who already have. And this work is bigger than one channel, one politician, or one election. It needs creators, educators, campaigners, analysts, writers, local organizers, and ordinary people who are willing to move the message through their own communities. Some people will do that in politics, some will do it in media, some will do it with videos, some with articles, some with conversations at a kitchen table. I do not care about the format, I care about the spread. The opportunity is enormous because the old institutions moved far too slowly. Traditional media lost power, social media became the battleground, and the center in many countries acted as if none of that mattered. That vacuum is still there. which means the people who move clearly, repeatedly, and compassionately on the real issue can still shape the new settlement. That last word matters, by the way. Compassion. You do not build anything durable by humiliating people or excluding them. You persuade, you explain, you invite, you keep the message simple enough to travel and serious enough to survive contact with reality. The reason you are getting poorer is growing inequality. If we do not do something serious about it, your children will be poorer too. Those two ideas, stated clearly and often enough, have enormous force. And that is why I am not gloomy, even though the old order is breaking in ways that will produce a lot of chaos. I see the risk, certainly, but I also see the opening. The old center may yet adapt. It may make a serious offer. It may recognize that survival now requires more than managerial competence and nicer messaging. If it does, good. If it does not, it will continue to fragment, and something else will rise in its place. Either way, the age of automatic two-party comfort is ending. Britain has shown you that. Europe has shown you that. The numbers have shown you that. And if you are wise, you stop waiting for the establishment to explain what is happening and start acting as if the realignment is already here, because it is. So I would tell you to do three things. First, vote every time, no exceptions, national, local, whatever is available to you. Power compounds where participation compounds. Second, judge political forces by the clarity and seriousness of their offer on inequality, not by their branding. Do not confuse performance with intent. Third, become part of the educational engine. Repeat the message, spread the logic, help more people understand why the old settlement is failing. If enough people do that, then this political fracture will not just be a period of confusion, it will become a period of leverage. And leverage, used at the right moment, changes history. What Britain has broken is bigger than one election cycle. A 2-century pattern is cracking. That is dangerous. It is also an opportunity. And opportunities like this do not stay open forever.